Hi, and welcome back to the first video of the 10th lecture of Covidenomics. In this 10th lecture, we're going to be looking at the interaction between data, or data, depending on how you pronounce it. We're going to be looking at the economics of data and how data interacts with fighting the coronavirus pandemic. We're then going to look at the specific examples of how Taiwan and South Korea use data to help successfully keep down the infection levels from COVID-19, before finally considering some government policies that can apply, for example, here in Australia. First, though, we need to think about what is data. And to do that, I'm just going to draw on some introductory comments from this paper, Non-Rivalry and the Economics of Data, by Jones and Tonetti, published in the American Economic Review earlier this year. So, drawing on some earlier literature, including some by Paul Romer, Jones and Tonetti define information as any economic good that can be entirely represented as a bit string, in other words, by sequences of zeros and ones. There are two different types of information. Information is either an idea or a data. What is an idea? So an idea is simply a piece of information that is a set of instructions for making an economic good, which may include other ideas. Whereas data are simply all other forms of information. Jones and Tonetti note that data includes things like driving data, medical records, location data, information that is not itself instructions for making a good, although they may still be useful in the production process. So, for example, a production process that involves producing a new idea. So an idea is a production function, whereas Jones and Tonetti define data as an input to production. Jones and Tonetti note that data can be really useful for things like training machine learning. So data could be, a million pictures of cats or rainbows or kids, the sort of thing that is used as an input for training artificial intelligence so that, for example, through machine learning, a computer can recognise a kid or a rainbow or a cat. That's, in general, not what we're interested with here. Rather, we're going to be thinking about data from the perspective of how to deal with coronavirus. Once we've got the definition of data, we now need to note that from an economic perspective, data is an odd form of good, in the sense that it's non-rival. Just to remind you what this means, from your public goods lectures or chapters in your introductory microeconomics, you would have noted that goods can either be rivalrous or non-rivalrous, and they can be excludable or non-excludable. So what do these mean? A good is rivalrous if the fact that one person consumes a unit of that good means that nobody else can consume that same unit. Let me give an example. Let's say we have an apple. If I eat that apple, if I consume that apple, then people can consume different apples, but they cannot consume the same apple that I have just eaten, unless it's a really sick and scary horror film. So an apple is rivalrous in the sense that there is rivalry between consumers as to who can get to consume the good. Only one person will be able to consume a particular unit of a rivalrous product. However, information, including ideas and data, is non-rivalrous, in the sense that once we have a piece of information, I can use that information, you can use that information, anybody can use that same information. The fact that I use the information doesn't mean that there's less of it for anyone else. For example, if you have a great idea and you tell me, I can use that great idea as well, unless there's some law preventing me from doing so. Similarly, if you have 1,000 different images of cats on your computer, you can send them to me, and I can also have those same 1,000 images of cats. And I can send them on to lots of other people, and they can also have exactly that same data. They may not want it, but it's non-rivalrous. The fact that one person is consuming data does not in any way reduce the amount of data available for others. In contrast, a good is excludable if one person can prevent others from accessing a particular unit of that good. So for example, if you have an idea, but you have a patent on that idea, a patent is a legal property right saying that it is illegal for anyone else to use that idea, and if they do without your permission, you can sue them, then the law has made that idea excludable. Obviously, most goods are excludable. Again, let's go back to the apple. If I have an apple and you want to eat that apple, I can say, no, it's my apple. I can exclude you from eating that apple. What about a non-excludable good? Well, for example, if you want to go out tonight and look up at the sky and watch the stars, I can't stop you. The fact that I'm looking at the stars doesn't prevent you, so it's a non-rivalrous good. It's also non-excludable. I can't stop you from walking out and looking at the stars. You can also have non-excludable but rivalrous goods. For example, most of the roads in our cities are rivalrous. If you don't believe me, get on there at peak period and note that there's a whole bunch of congestion as people are fighting to get access to the same bit of road. But legally, it's not excludable. No one can put up a barrier and say, sorry, you're not jumping on the freeway this morning. That's a legal decision to make it non-excludable. Of course, you may have a toll road in your city, and a toll road is excludable in the sense that if you don't pay money to the owner of a toll road, they can fine you or stop you from travelling on that road. So an apple is both rivalrous and excludable, as are pretty much most other goods. Data is non-rivalrous, but generally is excludable. I can have a data set and I can prevent somebody else from having access to that same data set, even though it's non-rivalrous. The fact that they have access to that data doesn't mean I have any less access. A free road, like a freeway, in peak traffic is a good that is rivalrous, but non-excludable. Legally, it's non-excludable. And a good that is both non-rivalrous and non-excludable is what we call in economics a public good. Something, for example, like national defence can be considered a public good. It's non-rivalrous in the sense that if our country spends a lot of money to protect ourselves from foreign invasion, well, the fact that you're being protected from foreign invasion doesn't mean that I'm more open to foreign invasion or vice versa. So national defence is considered a non-rivalrous good. And it's non-excludable in the sense that if we have the Army or Navy or Air Force out there stopping somebody from invading our country, it's pretty hard for them to say, look, see that guy over there, yeah, you can invade him in his house, but no one else's, please. That's not the way the world works. So it's pretty much non-excludable too. Even if you are a pacifist, even if you do not believe in national defence, you are still getting the benefits of that national defence. Just a final point before we move on. When we're talking about public goods, in general, to get the optimal amount for society, you need some form of government intervention. A public good's a bit like a positive externality. If I decide to produce and consume some of that good, you get benefit as well, and you don't have to pay anything for it because it's non-rivalrous and it's non-excludable. That doesn't mean you don't get any of the good. You can still have private production of things that are essentially public goods. It means to get the optimal quantity, you need to have some form of government intervention, just like with externalities in general. That's important because sometimes you'll see people arguing, well, historically we had private lighthouses, so therefore lighthouses aren't a public good, even though if a ship goes past the lighthouse, it gets the benefit and can't be excluded, and the ship goes past the lighthouse and it's non-rivalrous in the sense that because one ship sees the light from the lighthouse and avoids the rocks, that doesn't mean there's less light for any other ship. They can all avoid the rocks by watching the light from the lighthouse. So a lighthouse is put up as an example of a public good. Historically, there was private production of lighthouses, often by nearby ports. The logic behind that is pretty obvious. You want to encourage ships to use your port. But that doesn't mean they're not public goods. It just means that there was probably an underproduction of lighthouse services when they were purely being carried out by private ports. So that's a bit of a confusion that you come across all the time. Whenever you move away from our standard goods, you probably have some sort of role for government intervention, particularly for a public good, but that doesn't mean that nothing happens without government intervention. It just means you can improve the situation through well thought out government policy. So just to summarise, data is non-rival, so at a technological level, data is infinitely usable. The fact that you have a string of zeros and ones stored on your computer doesn't mean that there's any less of that string for somebody else to store. However, data may be excludable. It may simply be excludable because I have it and I refuse to transfer it to you. It may be excludable for legal reasons. So there may be laws in place that say you cannot have access to that data. If you do so, you're violating the law and will end up in prison. There are some good reasons why we have those laws in certain circumstances, often relating to privacy. Some of the data that's out there is about individuals, and those individuals may not want that data shared. So legally we make that data excludable to try and protect privacy. From the perspective of fighting COVID-19, data that can be really important to government is, for example, information on where you have been and who you've been close to, particularly if you've just tested positive for the virus. So where would that data come from? Well, one way that that data is assembled is by the government asking an individual who's tested positive, what have you been up to for the last 48 hours or so? Who have you met? Where have you been? Can you remember everyone that you were with for more than 15 minutes in close proximity, preferably indoors? That's a pretty fallible way of doing it, but actually a lot of the world's test and trace systems for coronavirus work on that basis. They simply get the data by asking the individual. A more sophisticated approach, however, would gain the relevant data from other sources. And a lot of this data is jointly created. So it may be your location data, but that data in the form that it can be used, for example, by government to test and trace, that data will have been created by you interacting with another product, another good or another service, where the relevant data is created by your interactions. So we can think of data in that situation as a jointly created product. Well, let's consider that example of location data a bit further. As I said, we could have location data based on memory. That would just need the individual. But a more sophisticated system might use location data that's created by a consumer together with their Maps app on their phone. So why is that data created? Well, it may be created because the individual consumer wants to use Maps to get somewhere, to get to a particular location. Their mobile phone uses location data so that when someone tries to ring your phone, the telephone system knows how to get to your phone. They need to know where your phone is to send the message, send the call through the closest mobile telephone tower. So in those situations, your location data is jointly created by your use of a Maps app and by the fact that you have a mobile phone and want to be able to send and receive calls. Notice in both those examples for location data, maps, when we're thinking about maps and when we're thinking about your phone's location to send and receive calls, in a sense, your location data is sort of a side product of other activities. For example, when you're using your phone, yes, it collects data on your location, but that's not the point. That's not what you value. It's simply something that has to be produced, data or information that has to be produced to make your phone functional. Similarly, when you're using Google Maps to go to visit a friend whose address you can't remember how to get there, Google Maps will store your location data. But really, that's just part of creating a product that you value, which is getting to your friend's house. So in that sense, data can be a side product of other activities. Another example is simply data about your preferences when searching online or buying a product. When you search online, you look through, for example, a bunch of websites looking for, say, a new pair of shoes of a particular brand. All of a sudden, you're bombarded with a whole bunch of ads for similar shoes or that particular shoe at really cheap prices from various sellers. You didn't intend to be bombarded with ads. Rather, the search engine, or perhaps Facebook, has gained data about your preferences, the fact that you're interested in buying that pair of shoes, by your search activity, and then they've, in a sense, on-sold that information so that advertisers can try and target you with their particular products. In some situations, data can be more valuable when it's brought together, when it's aggregated, when it's part of a large data set. Think back to the example from Jones and Tonetti earlier on in this video of 1,000 pictures of a cat. 1,000 cat pictures in general, one cat picture isn't very useful, it can't train any computer, but if you're trying to train artificial intelligence, 1,000 cat pictures or 1,000,000 cat pictures can be really, really valuable. Another simple example, how does a bank know whether or not to lend to a customer? Well, the way that banks do that is through getting a lot of credit data. In other words, what banks get is a massive data about a range of individuals, what their income is, what their marital status is, where they lived, whether they were employed, and so on. All of that data is brought together. They don't actually care about the individual, but they care about bringing all of that data together, all of that credit record data, so that they can then predict whether a customer with particular attributes will be a good or a bad risk. So banks use aggregated credit data, and almost always anonymised aggregated credit data, to try and work out whether or not to lend to a specific customer. Another example is health data. So how do health researchers work out who is at risk of a particular disease? Well, one way that they do that is by using aggregated and again anonymised health data. So you get the data on literally thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals, relevant features relating to their lifestyle, perhaps their genetic history, and from that you can start making predictions about whether a specific individual will be at risk of a disease based on their particular characteristics. And again, some of you may have heard of genome projects that are doing this sort of research to try and work out what are the differences in the genome, the DNA of people who are at risk of certain diseases versus those who have a lower risk of those diseases. And that's based on literally millions of samples of individual DNA. They don't care whose DNA in particular they're looking at. They care about the attributes of that individual, whether that individual in particular had the disease or not, and then they're comparing the DNA between those millions of people to try and improve our predictability of health. So let's summarise where we've got to so far. First, data is a type of information. Second, data is non-rivalrous, although it may be excludable. Third, much data is jointly created. So it's you and your search engine create the data that is then used by internet advertisers. It's you and your doctor who create, through the tests, your health data and your health records. Fourthly, data may be a side product of other activities. So doing one thing, getting one product, may actually involve creating valuable data that isn't related to that specific product. And fifthly, while individual data may be valuable, for example, Facebook is interested in selling data about you to advertisers, sometimes data is even more valuable if it's aggregated, even if it's anonymised, even if the individual identifier is removed. Aggregate data can provide important statistical insights. Data is not only important from the point of view of coronavirus and the pandemic. Data is a big issue in a huge part of our economic activity. And that is because we've essentially had a revolution over the last, particularly 50 years, in terms of computing power, in terms of ability to store data, ability to transmit data, which means that the production of data has literally gone through the roof. So here's the production of data since 2005. It's given up until about 2015, with the prediction coming on after 2015 from the United Nations. If that looks a bit like an exponential growth curve, you're dead right. That's what it is. Data has been increasing at an exponential rate because of technological progress. Unfortunately, both our understanding of that data and our legal system to deal with data have not progressed at the same rate. That means that there's an ongoing debate about data rights, about data ownership, about who should be allowed to exclude other parties from using data, and that is continuing whilst the pandemic's going on. For example, if we look at Australia, here's some summary data about the sort of risks that Australians take with their data. So around 7 in 10 Australians use social media, but very few Australians protect their data that they provide through social media. In fact, most Australians don't even know what rights social media companies have over their data. Data's not just through social media, it's also gained through customer loyalty programs. Don't for one instant think that those cards that you're getting from retailers that you enter each time, that the only point of those is to make sure you come back next time. Those cards provide valuable data that the retailers themselves can use to actually improve their service for you, but also potentially to on-sell that data to other retailers. And around about half of Australians are simply unaware of what data is collected about them and even how that data is collected. Very few of us take actions to protect our privacy, even though, when asked, we often say that privacy and privacy around our data is extremely important. I remember being involved in a seminar a few years back where I was talking about data rights, and there was quite a few lawyers in there, and the lawyers were very, very strong on privacy and the importance of privacy. Despite that, I decided to do a little poll, and I said, well, how many of you have heard of the anonymised search engine DuckDuckGo, which protects your privacy? And almost everyone in the room put up their hand. And I then said, keep your hand up if you actually use DuckDuckGo versus one of the other major search engines such as Google or Bing or Firefox. And only one person kept his hand up. We talk a lot about privacy, and a lot of the debate on data is couched in terms of privacy. But as an economist, I'm always sceptical because revealed preference tends to suggest that we're very happy to give up our privacy for a tiny, tiny bit of convenience. So when we may talk about privacy, it's not clear how much we really value it. We're going to come back to some of these issues later on in this lecture, but leave it there for now. We've talked about what data is. We're now going to move on in the next video to consider Taiwan and South Korea and how they use data to help fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks for listening.